evening. Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Gary Weiss. He is an investigative journalist, an author of books about Wall Street ethics. He's a former contributing editor to the Condé Nast portfolio, and he is with us today to discuss his latest book about Crazy Eddie, a con artist who became known for his stores for electronic devices and various businesses and failed ventures that seem to be a precursor to later frauds, Ponzi schemers, and overall business disasters such as Enron, Bernie Madoff, Theranos, and today the best known mess du jour, FTX, of course. So we're going to delve a little bit into that and figure out why after what seemed to be a promising start, all these guys flame out, and why is the public no better at distinguishing frauds and schemers from legitimate entrepreneurs. But before we get into that, I would like to turn to Gary and ask him a little bit about his work. How did you decide to focus your investigative work on Wall Street, on business ventures, and how did you come to these subjects?
Well, first, I want to thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure. Appreciate it very much. Well, I'm just a long-time journalist. I've been working for a business publication for a long time. You just sort of melt into things after a while, and I was working for Barron's and then for Business Week. And then before you know it, I was writing about fraud and crime. When you write about business, you write about Wall Street, it's kind of natural that you'd write about fraud and crime. And I guess nowadays you write about crypto and you're going to be writing about fraud and crime. So that's how I wound up. And my work in the 90s was mainly on like fraud and mafia on Wall Street. That was one of the big things I was doing back in the 90s. And skipping ahead, more recently, I got to know the whistleblower, the principal whistleblower in the Crazy Eddie fraud. Which took place in the 1980s, 1970s. I think it's one of the most fascinating stories I've ever. Interesting ones. It was a big electronics chain that went bust, and among a big glare of publicity, it was a very widely known, widely publicized chain because of its advertising. And what I think is interesting is we can, I imagine, explore is how it was sort of a precursor of many well-known frauds, including the ones that are taking place right now. FDX and, I guess Elizabeth Holmes and all that stuff. It just shows that, you begin, it's like you start out with a good model, like a good model car, and you add to it, and you're going to get a great sedan or whatever. And this is sort of what happened. Crazy Eddie came up with a really good template for fraud, and god dang it, it really took off. And to this day, it's still being used. So
the one pattern that I've seen across a wide variety of frauds, some of whom, by the way, later historically have become great sources for the FBI and so forth, but not all of them, obviously, is that they seem to have a talent, a knack for identifying what works with the public perception and create this successful business model. And a lot of it takes a lot of work, talent, dedication to detail to pull off successfully. You can't just go around throwing dust in people's eyes. You have to make it convincing, almost as convincing as a real enterprise. You build it up as an operation. So the question I've always had, if these guys are willing to dedicate so much effort to pull a fast one, why can't they build a legitimate business, with maybe a little bit more investment, but similarly the same type of skill?
Well, to begin with, in the case of Crazy Eddie, there really was a genuine successful business. Well, it wasn't really that successful, but there was a genuine business behind Crazy Eddie, just as there was sort of a business of sorts behind both Holmes and Sam Bankman-Fried's recent ventures, but the thing is, the reason that these things become frauds is to make a lot of money. I mean, it's kind of a simple sort of a passe answer, but in order for people, Eddie Antar, the chief the chief executive of Crazy Eddie. He just wanted to make a ton of money, and it sort of came down to that. Yes, he could have, he was set up in business by his father in Brooklyn, and he could have, had a legitimate life, lived, created a, reasonably successful, okay business, a lifestyle for himself and his family. But he wanted to get filthy rich, and he did. And this is the same thing. I hesitate to ascribe motives to Sam Bankman-Fried, because after all, he hasn't actually been criminally charged or anything like that. But certainly Elizabeth Holmes, in her case, she's awaiting sentencing, and she certainly, I think, was motivated, by the old-fashioned greed, and a certain, I think, a sort of an obtuseness on the subject of consequences. You find that in all these cases where they just don't expect that they're ever going to be caught. They don't think, they're not good chess players. They don't think 2-3 steps ahead. And that, I think, is one of the commonalities of all these people.
Are these guys all basically sociopaths with no conscience? Is that what makes them just pursue a life of crime as opposed to something more legitimate?
Well, that's a really good question. Sociopath is, it's a psychological term, and I've never actually had, shall we say, Eddie Andor on the couch, so to speak. Yeah, I mean, obviously, he, when you plead guilty to racketeering, and you've stolen quite as much money as he did, it does kind of speak to him being a sociopath. I think that's probably a fair statement. It's probably also the case with Elizabeth Banks, Elizabeth Holmes. The gentleman at FTX, as I say, he hasn't been criminally prosecuted yet, so we want to be careful there. But what is a sociopath? A sociopath is an individual who has really no real grasp of consequences and does things that are illegal, and I think this is kind of true. Depending on how you define sociopath, I think this is definitely true. Yeah.
From everything that you've written and that was discussed about your book, Eddie Antar seemed to be quite a colorful character. He emerged from a Syrian Jewish community. That community is actually well known for well-established, very successful businesses, and it's a very wealthy community, and not obviously most of them are not in fact frauds. They are. Why was Eddie not more successful on his own terms compared to all these other people? The community has quite a number of billionaires among them. Many of them are involved in politics as well. So they're not. These are all successful people who managed to make a lot of money from legitimate businesses.
Well, he chose to go into the electronic business in the early 1980s. Well, it was 1969. He chose to go into the electronic business. That was sort of what he worked out with his father, who set him up in business. And back in the late 60s, early 70s, it was very hard to establish yourself in the electronics business. So he's just sort of maneuvered his way through the shoals of the electronic business by, among other things, committing crimes, stealing sales tax, committing insurance fraud, and all the frauds, types of frauds that I outline in my book. It was sort of a choice on his part. In other words, he wanted to become filthy rich, and he wanted to become filthy rich in the consumer electronics business. And in order to do that, sort of the easy way to do that was by committing crimes, such as I mentioned, stealing sales tax. That was how he was able to gain an edge over the competition. Certainly in the early days, he began by charging. He charged sales tax, but rather than pass on the sales tax to the government, he kept it, and that's how he gave him sort of a built-in profit margin. Therefore, he was able to undercut his competitors on price. So that's the kind of thing that that's why he sort of became a criminal, and he was willing to commit these crimes. Whereas people, the other successful people in the Syrian Jewish community, just they were just very skilled businessmen. They didn't have to commit crimes.
So interestingly enough, this electronics business model seems to me pretty straightforward. Cryptocurrency, it's an unregulated industry. It's innovative industry. Most people don't understand how exactly it works.
That's right.
Theranos was also trying to work in this blood testing biological arena. That's also, most people are not involved in science. They don't know what's going on. But electronics business seems to be forward, typical business venture. How did Eddie manage to get away with petty crimes that built up to this criminal empire for as long as he did? Why was he not caught earlier?
Well, he wasn't caught earlier, really, for sort of the same reasons why Bankman-Fried and the Theranos weren't caught earlier. It's because people, it was sort of a failure of imagination, and because of the things that Eddie did and that Holmes did and Bankman-Fried did to create an aura of respectability. For instance, I was very interested to see that FDX had the same white shoe law firm that Crazy Eddie did. Eddie Antar had Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison. It's a very, you're dealing with a company that has such a prestigious law firm, and in the case of Crazy Eddie, prestigious underwriters when they had an initial public offering, prestigious accounting firm doing its books. It creates an aura of respectability, which sort of dulls the senses of people looking at it, reduces the amount of skepticism. So, for instance, in the case of FDX, in that case, Bankman-Fried was the second largest donor to the Democratic Party in the 2021-2022 cycle. And this, certainly gave him a certain aura. And in Eddie's case, we're dealing with a company that was not only, had, very highly reputable investment bankers and highly reputable law firms, but also it had a public presence. It had these screamer commercials, our prices are insane, by the famous pitchman Jerry Carroll. So it had a public presence throughout the Northeast. So you figure, well, look, this is a company that's got stores all over the place, and they sell electronics, and everyone knew that. How could it possibly be a fraud? It's all over the TV. It was a cultural icon back in the 70s and 80s. How could this be a fraud? And people get their senses are dulled by that.
While one can excuse the average consumer who does not, is not privy to financial records and so forth, what can be said about the white shoe law firms, the bankers, the accountants who did see that there was something funny going on? Where were they that entire time?
Well, they were committing fraud from the very beginning, and the fraud escalated when they chose in the early 1980s to become a public company, when they had an IPO. At that point, it was decided to they'd been skimming cash. The family had been skimming cash for a long time. That's one of the things they did. They committed income tax evasion by skimming profits from the company, and it was decided to reverse the skim and put money into it was decided actually at that point not to reverse the skim, but to remove the amount of money from the company to reduce the skim, so as to increase the profit growth. So they fabricated profit growth for the purposes of the IPO to show that there was actual profit growth where there really wasn't. They weren't really growing. Now, in doing that, they fooled the white shoe law firm that they had working for them. They fooled mainly the auditors that they had, all major firms. And the reason they were able to fool them on that particular aspect that I just mentioned, the reason they were able to fool them on that and on falsifying inventories, which is another thing they did to boost profits subsequently, is because these these professionals were not accustomed to dealing with outright criminals. They were not. It was a failure of imagination. They did not think that they, in order, they believed Crazy Eddie when they saw the spreadsheets of the profits showing a massive increase in profits on the run up to the IPO. They did not believe, it was not part of their thinking that, well, maybe they're just making up these numbers. It just didn't occur to them.
But regardless of what faith they had in their client, weren't there red flags that would point to the fabrication of evidence that you cannot ignore, regardless of how you feel about the motivation and the psychology of your client? Even if you don't think that the client is motivated to commit crime, if there is an irregularity for whatever reason, wouldn't that have come to their attention at some point and raise some questions at the very least?
Well, it certainly should have. They should have certainly been more skeptical. And for instance, but they made blunders. They committed blunders. The accountants from Main Herdman, which was the big firm that was auditing their books, which later became part of KPMG, which was to this day a big accounting firm. They were completely fooled by the people working in the warehouses when the time came to inflate what was in the warehouses. You see, it's not generally known. Certainly wasn't generally known among people working in the warehouses. But if you overstate the inventories that are in the warehouses, you will, on a dollar for dollar basis, overstate your profits, because that's how profits are calculated in a retail company. So they would systematically overstate. This is after they became public. They would systematically overstate what was in their warehouses, and they did that by just charming the pants off the auditors. The auditors who came in. The auditors were actually in the warehouses. They would be performing test counts. Is this an accurate count? That's are the what's on the spreadsheets, are they accurate? They perform test counts, and this was known to the people from Crazy Eddie. They would just simply work with these guys and just mislead them so that they didn't do their jobs.
I'll get back to the culpability of all these enterprises in a little bit, but before, I want to come back to Eddie. And there's something about this whole story that really struck me. We have this Hollywood stereotype of a charming, con artist who doesn't mean any harm, who engages in these affairs that are essentially victimless, and who is not a bad person at heart, but just is down on his luck and ends up, coming out on top, and everybody is okay. Eddie was not an example of that. From everything you write, he had a very messy personal life. He was abusive to his first wife. He was not a good guy. He was not a good character at all. How did he manage not to project this completely tyrannical tendency at home? How did he manage to charm his way in public anyway? And how did his abusive personal behavior not come out?
Well, Eddie was very secretive. He wasn't like Holmes or Bankman-Fried. He was a very, even though the company had quite a public persona, he personally avoided publicity for the majority of the time that Crazy Eddie was in existence. So, as a matter of fact, yes, he was a wife beater. He was at one point stabbed at a nightclub on the Upper West Side. It received no publicity. His domestic entanglements until the very end, his wife abuse and so forth, his very messy divorce did not receive any publicity because he was a very private person. So he was excellent when it came to keeping his private life private. He was very secretive until the latter stages of his life, where he tried to get public sympathy and so forth. We went public, but the only times he ever really had any kind of public persona was in dealing with the analysts. And he was very charming to the analysts. They didn't see that other side of Eddie. He was very charming to them. And when there were rumors did occasionally creep out that, that he was having domestic difficulties, they were quashed by his public relations guy.
Now, this is all very interesting to me because today's paparazzi are decried for being exceptionally involved in public lives of celebrities and practically stalking business people and public personalities, no matter how private they are, and sniffing out scandalous stories, divorces, family scuffles, whatever. If Eddie was such a powerful public figure who, even however privately he behaved, why wasn't the media more nosy about him personal? What did he get a break from them?
Well, to begin with, you have to remember that there was no inkling that there was anything unusual about this particular CEO. Things came out in the press that, well, this is a secretive, this is a publicity shy CEO, and it wasn't unusual to have a publicity shy CEO. Some CEOs are publicity shy, so there was just simply the fact that he wouldn't give interviews. He didn't give interviews, so and he didn't let his photograph until the very end. He didn't let his photograph appear in the press. He wouldn't let himself be photographed. His photo did not appear in the annual reports. And he had kind of like this charmed life, this good luck. I mean, for instance, there was he had a unit, he had a business unit up in Vermont, where he manufactured speakers, and there was this big problem up in Vermont. People were suing him up there, and it was a huge problem. It got on the wire services, it got on the Associated Press wire, but despite that, it sort of never, it didn't filter its way down to Brooklyn. I mean, it just sort of stayed up there in Vermont. So he had very good luck, a very good publicist, and he was very good at keeping secret.
It's funny that we talk about this quintessential New York character, and then some of his employees that ended up being deceived, misled, abused, screwed over by him. They ended up, returning to him or being somewhat loyal to him, and they claimed that they loved him even despite all these horrible characteristics. There's another famous business person slash public personality that comes to mind that fits this entire description, and that is none other than former President Donald J. Trump. There seems to be quite a great degree of similarity in the entire presentation of this personality, this publicly affable kind of persona, rough around the edges but relatable to certain blue collar types. The businesses are famous, and yet there is a lot of lawsuits and various things that are questionable, and nevertheless still some people continue to follow him to this day. Do you think there's any coincidence that these two individuals emerged in the public view in the same kind of time period, in the same area, and just basically share so many characteristics that continue to hold the imagination of some people to this day?
Well, both Trump and Crazy Eddie certainly were big publicity hogs. Crazy Eddie was all over the newspapers. It was had a very big public persona. It was an outer borough phenomenon, and it came out of Brooklyn, just as Trump came out of Queens, to Manhattan, and his father was a big Queens real estate mogul, Queens Brooklyn real estate mogul, and then Trump moved into Manhattan. The difference, and they were both very big and very much a tabloid presence at the same time in the early 1980s, 70s, and 80s. The difference is that Donald Trump personally was a real publicity hound, and he was forever Percy's Puss was constantly in the press, whereas Eddie stayed out of it. He was secret. His alter ego, so to speak, Jerry Carroll, the character who is on the cover of my book, it was in all the commercials. Jerry Carroll, he was sort of the public persona of Crazy Eddie. As a matter of fact, many people thought that he was Eddie. But I think there's sort of a difference between Donald Trump and his publicity seeking and Eddie Antar and Crazy Eddie. I think the similarity that's kind of interesting is that Trump has continually over the years been accused of inflating the value of his holdings, both from the standpoint of just ego and from a business standpoint. And that was also the case with Crazy Eddie. Crazy Eddie, of course, collapsed because of inflation of holdings. So there certainly is that. There certainly is that commonality.
How did Eddie come up with this iconic image and with this character that he pushed in everyone's face? Where is that coming from? What made it so appealing if people were so aggravated by it? It was kind of annoying. What inspired it?
Well, he came up with the idea. I mean, Eddie came up with the idea in the early '70s of the crazy merchant. He started out calling his company Sights and Sounds, very bland name for business. That was changed to around 1972 or so. It was changed to Crazy Eddie because he came up. It wasn't an idea that it was an idea that he kind of stole. It was the crazy merchant trope kind of thing. It's been around for many, many decades, long preceded Crazy Eddie. I'm so crazy. I'm selling prices that are far too low. That's old as the hills. So he took that old method of that old sort of old line kind of thing, and he turned it into a very successful pitch for his company. He started out taking ads in like the Village Voice, did a very sort of counterculture themed ads. And then he hired an ad guy named Larry Weiss, no relation, who a very talented kid from Long Island, and he hired Jerry Carroll. Jerry was a disc jockey from Yonkers originally. He was WPIX. He was a WPIX radio disc jockey, and he hired him to do the commercials. And sort of it was that was how the Crazy Eddie persona, the public persona developed. But it's very sort of interesting and important to point out that marketing aspect of the company was completely separate from the sort of the fraud aspects of the company. In other words, they were running a real marketing marvel on the public airwaves at the same time as in the back of the store, so to speak, they were committing all kinds of frauds. And one didn't really have all that much to do with the other.
So it's funny, their real talent, it seems, lay in branding, in PR, and they could have made, an entire empire just built on branding, just as to some extent Donald Trump's most successful venture was not any of his real estate businesses, but the branding that he created for himself. And had both of them stuck to just those things, perhaps they would have been, had far more legitimacy and far more success than by venturing outside what worked best. It seems, however, that at the time PR was on its own, outside business was perhaps not something that he thought of worth pursuing. But he certainly sounds like he certainly had a knack for really getting into the heads of people. Now, it seems to me it sounds like he also managed to get a number of his family members involved into this scheme, and one of them, you said, Sam Ontar, became one of your main source for the book. How did you encounter him?
Well, as you point out, Sam Anser he was the whistleblower or the informant, so to speak, who eventually blew the whistle on Eddie. He grew up he was Eddie's kid cousin, and he grew up in the business. He worked for Crazy Eddie since he was a kid. Since he was like 12 years old, 12, 13 years old. And he became chief financial officer. Well, he was educated. Eddie put him through school. He became an accountant, a CPA, and then he became chief financial officer of the company. And then when the company had its downfall, he became the principal witness for the prosecution. Now I get to know Sam. Actually, it was just sort of happenstance. I was keeping a blog back in then 15 years ago, and he commented on one of my blog items, and I thought it was very interesting. So I sort of got to know Sam, and I got interested in telling the story of Crazy Eddie because he had very interesting insights into the company and into the downfall of Crazy Eddie.
What made Sam finally blow the whistle after being involved in all these schemes and seeing the inside of what was obviously a criminal enterprise for such a long time?
Well, that's kind of the through plot of the book, by the way, I should point out. That's sort of, as Sam's evolution from naive, nerdy kid to top executive through informant. As I said, he was brought up in the business. He was the son of Eddie's. Eddie's father was his uncle, and Sam E. Antar. When the company began to collapse, Eddie fled to Israel, and he sort of washed his hands of the company, and he left the people who remained to sort of clean up the mess that he created. Now, keep in mind, Sam E. Antar, as the chief financial officer, he was a major participant in the frauds. He designed some of the frauds along with Eddie. After all, these were accounting frauds. Some of the biggest ones were accounting frauds. So when the whole thing collapsed, Sam decided, look, and Eddie treated, like, just the way he treated his wife badly, and he treated people badly. He treated everybody badly who came into contact with. He treated Sam badly. He wouldn't pay for his legal fees, even though Sam was engaged in litigation, sort of on Eddie's behalf. So Sam realized, look, he's been abandoned by his cousin. Everybody hates him. He was in debt. He didn't want to go to prison for 20 years. So he went to the feds, and the feds didn't believe him. The feds they had their own informants who didn't know the whole story, but they got there first, you see, and that gave them an advantage. So initially, they didn't believe him. Over time, he convinced them that he was on the level, and that he was able to finally sort of win them over. And it was a long process, but he finally became the principal witness against Eddie at the trial. When Eddie went
Well,
on trial.
that sounds like a very dramatic denouement, considering that the whole enterprise was a family business to begin with, and the entire community, the Syrian Jewish community, is very tight knit and was even more so at the time. What impact did all of this have on the community? What was the reaction of their neighbors, the people, and other relatives, and so forth?
Well, it varied. Sam was a witness against his cousin, and there's a feeling among some of the community who sided with the Antars. You don't want to become a witness against your own people, whatever. But I think the way it sort of wound up, Eddie, people aren't fools. They know what's going on. Eddie was viewed as a shamed, as a shanda, as they say, and he was viewed as a shame, as a source of shame to the community. So that's kind of where it wound up, that Eddie, it's not as if the Syrian community just sort of like gathered around Eddie. Just as when he went to Israel, the Israelis, they didn't want him there, and one of the reasons they didn't want him there is because he was breaking the laws of Israel. He became a citizen of Israel. And not only did he become this was the whole design, he fled to Israel. So not only did he become a citizen of Israel with the intent of avoiding extradition to the United States and prosecution for his crimes, but he created a false persona, an alias, and he made his alias a citizen of Israel. And that really irritated the Israelis. So they wanted to get rid of him. So he was like not a good person. People aren't stupid. He was not. He was recognized. And after the fraud broke, he could no longer really pull the wool over people's eyes.
We've seen, eventually, he went to prison. He eventually did not, and well, he died relatively young at 68. What, by the way, was the cause of death? What happened?
Well, it's not clear what his cause of death was. That hasn't been publicly disclosed. The general's feeling that it was some liver problem. It might have been cancer of the liver by one instance. That's not something I was able to determine. Died of natural causes. That's the thing.
Now, you would think that his story would serve, as a lesson for the general society, for the business world. Nevertheless, since then, we have seen one fraud in one failed business venture after another, with the famous Enron scandals of the early 2000s being, huge and having actual global impact due to the financial due to the scope and scale of the financial issues that were uncovered. And then we've had, of course, Bernie Madoff, who preyed specifically on the Jewish community while posing as a philanthropist.
That's right.
And then we had Theranos, Elizabeth Holmes, who managed to attract celebrities and politicians to her board, none of whom, saw through the scheme. And now we have the FTX character who also posed as a philanthropical crypto entrepreneur, supposedly bailing out struggling startups. So we have this image of do-gooders and impressive figures who are nevertheless involved in all sorts of shenanigans. Now, that's what brings me, first of all, back to the people who really should have known better, which is the lawyers and the accountants. They are the very sophisticated fiduciary entities who are supposed to advise clients and the public how to avoid committing crimes, making mistakes, and who have the skills to determine when there's something seriously wrong. What happened with all of these cases? Where were the lawyers? Where were the accountants, auditors, and the armies of professionals who were also involved in all of this?
Well, of course, you had in the case of Crazy Eddie, there was, my goodness, there was Oppenheimer and Company, very prestigious investment bank, very prestigious. There was Paul Weiss, as I mentioned, who, of course, now is the attorney became the attorney for this Sam Beekman-Fried. They were the top accounting firms, but what happened to them? Nothing. The accounting firm was sued. I mean, you have to remember also the law firm. I don't think anyone ever accused Paul Weiss of wrongful conduct. They represented Eddie. Their responsibility was to Eddie and to Crazy Eddie, and I don't think anyone ever accused Paul Weiss of being shady or deliberately trying to. That's not true. The accounting firm was different. The accounting firm had a responsibility to the public. The responsibility to the public to audit I mean, an auditor, it's like when you go to the IRS, when your tax returns are audited, they're supposed to find out if you did something wrong. And the same thing with auditing of financial statements of public companies. And they did not, and also Oppenheimer, when they went public, they did a due diligence, the purpose of which was to find out whether that company was being ethically run. So Oppenheimer, the accounting firms, look, they were all sued, and nothing ever really came of it. There was no, they did not, the plaintiffs, there were class action suits filed against them, and nothing came of that. It's very hard to, when you're filing a class action suit, it's very, very hard to prevail. And they didn't prevail, because you have to find that there's a very high level of proof to find that they prevail. But I think the lesson, though, and I think also that another problematic issue, shall we say, that was raised recently with Theranos and with FTX, and less so with Crazy Eddie, but also with Crazy Eddie, was the role of the financial press. The fact that the financial press never really found out what was going on at Crazy Eddie. Now, that was in a way almost excusable, because it was all going on behind closed doors, and it was accounting fraud in the warehouses, and it's very, very hard for journalists to find out what's going on when you have things going on behind in that fashion. But you had a situation with Theranos, for instance, and it's received some attention, in which there was a New Yorker profile was done of Theranos by Ken Oleta. And Ken Oleta, as was later reported in Vanity Fair, Ken Oleta said that he asked Elizabeth Holmes, how does this blood thing work? Give me go through the detail. And he said that she gave him a lot of gobbledygook. Nevertheless, although there was a skeptical aspect to that profile, that certainly did not result in the fraud being revealed. Eventually, it was revealed by a Wall Street Journal reporter, John Kerry, I believe his name was. But certainly, FTX, they were getting puff pieces after puff pieces. And so but just as there were puff pieces on Crazy Eddie, so the financial press also failed, and also acted to sort of a way as an accomplice of both Crazy Eddie, Theranos, and FTX. That's another commonality. That's a real commonality.
So there's this willingness of these journalists and other people to build up these characters who don't have anything behind them. There's a saying, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. Crazy Eddie's story was an early precursor, and you did say that people were naive, they were fooled. Eddie was, nobody thought of dealing with criminals, because Eddie didn't come across as some, street thug, who spent time in prison. But by the time Enron and Bernie Madoff and the Wolf of Wall Street and all these guys came around, and girls now with Elizabeth Holmes and possibly some of the Alameda characters, the female counterpart to FTX, how all of this stuff clearly has an almost identical pattern, and all of these people, they see what their precursors have done successfully, and I don't believe they don't learn from past precedents. In some cases, they deliberately imitate them. Elizabeth Holmes deliberately imitated this whole big tech crowd and Steve Jobs specifically. So they know what they're doing, and so should the public and the media. So how do they not see shameless imitation and puffery away from legitimate business? Where do you draw the line between people like, say, Zuckerberg and whoever, whatever you want to call, to make of them? They didn't, engage in complete financial fraud, building themselves up. You can criticize them for many other things, but not for that. Not for outright criminality.
Well, I think part of it is organic to the press, and I can tell you how that is. I mean, first of all, the tech reporters who covered FDX, the reporters covering crypto, they were like in nursery school when Enron broke in 2000. That was 22 years ago. We're not talking about the tech press. They're just too. They were, I think, just too young. They didn't live through that, and maybe they may have read about it, and maybe not, but they did not experience it. They just simply didn't have the background. The other thing, which I think is organic to the press, but to the financial press in particular, is that there is a predisposition to idolize the rich. I know that the press has a reputation for being, sort of like very, in the bed, very woke and so forth and so on. But in the financial press, and I think that's true, by the way. But the financial press, throughout the years, throughout maybe the decades and maybe centuries, the financial press has always has always idolized the wealthy and is always looking for the next big thing. Holmes was touted as the next, whatever, the next super billionaire. FDX's guy, Bankman-Fried, was touted as the next Warren Buffett. Someone once called him. And the day-to-day coverage was by young and inexperienced reporters. And there is a predisposition to write favorable articles on these people because it's an access game. If you don't write favorable articles on these people, they will not give you interviews. And not only will they not give you interviews, but a lot of these tech outfits, these tech journalists, they also engage in conferences where they want to invite some of the people who were interviewed in their article. And they're not going to, you're not going to get Bankman-Fried to come to your conference and be a keynote speaker if you just wrote a negative story about him. And as a matter of fact, when the Journal attempted to do a negative article on him back in, I guess it was 2016 or whenever it was, they brought David Boies, a famous attorney, to threaten the reporter. He and his firm marched into the Wall Street Journal offices. Actually, this was on Elizabeth Holmes. This was on Theranos. They marched into the offices and threatened them. There was a predisposition to do favorable pieces, a predisposition to do puff pieces. And that was the weakness. That was sort of the Achilles heel of the media, and is one of the principal reasons why Theranos and FDX were allowed to get away with what they did. Now, there was also a case with Crazy Eddie. They also were constantly showered with puff pieces. I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's a little bit less. They're a little bit less culpable because I think the fraud wasn't quite so obvious as it came to be with Theranos and FDX.
Nevertheless, we see no shortage of legitimate business people who achieve a great deal of success without even a fraction of the coverage that these whiz kids, as New York Times calls them, of a specific type. There's always the next big thing. People are making money all the time, a lot of money. Sometimes through just hard work, sometimes through a mixture of hard work and luck, but very often without any criminality at the very least. And yet, the people that make the news seem to be the people who are not the most hardworking, not the brightest necessarily, not the most successful, but the ones who know how to use the media the best. Because all of these guys, this is what they somehow manage to charm the media, whereas a lot of the legitimate business personalities, they're probably out there, they're probably working on the next big thing, the real big thing, but they're not necessarily talking to the media as much.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And they may not be talking to the media as much. And as I said, Eddie Antar did not talk to the media at all, and he still was idolized in the press. As a matter of fact, at one point during the period in which he wasn't talking to the press, he was described by a major Wall Street newsletter as the next Sam Walton, of Walmart. And this got a lot of attention. It appeared in a little publication called the Wall Street Transcript, and it spread like wildfire. It spread like wildfire through the media. The next Sam, Eddie Antar was the next Sam Walton, and he wasn't even getting interviews. And the same sort of attention, though fed by their willingness to give interviews, happened to this Sam Blankman-Fried, or whatever the hell his name is, and Elizabeth Holmes. They also were, the next big thing. There's always this desire to look for the next big thing. The whiz kids, as you say. These are the kids, they're our future, our future leaders, you see. So the press really loves that, they eat it up. Eddie, when he was the next Sam Walton, he was like 32. He was a young guy, same age as these guys, these bums that you've been reading about nowadays. That really was terrific. He was there along with the emperors of retail, and these guys were there with the titans of their particular industry, and since they always gave interviews, Holmes and Blankman-Fried, since they were constantly being interviewed and talking to the press and being witty and being charming and so forth, they were on the cover of business publications and non-business publications. I think one of the Times publications had Holmes on the cover.
Now, one thing that Mr. FTX said about himself actually is very telling, because a few people pointed it out, but it's not getting nearly the attention that it should, is that he was faking this whole philanthropic persona because that's what works. And people were falling for it, and he was kind of making fun of this whole woke culture, business culture of throwing money at philanthropic causes and social justice and all of that, because it makes it easy to prey on people. And the question is how much of what he was doing is actually an inherent part of today's culture, because we're seeing a lot of the BLM related donations were a huge fraud, and individually none of the people involved are nearly as impressively magnetic as Sam or any of these other guys, but as a whole, the enterprise of BLM and similar redistributionist groups, I'm not talking about the cause of Black Lives Matter, I'm talking about the organization, the actual infrastructure. They use the same channels, the same mechanisms, and they're being used by the same types of people, and all of that they were using the same political donations, and all of that sounds very similar actually, except that they
Look, you go to Carnegie Hall someday. When you go to, I'm sure you do all. If you're in New York, you go to Carnegie Hall, you go to Lincoln Center, and you got these programs. You open up the program, you go to the end, and there's a long list of people who give, mainly corporations and business executives who give money. Why do you think they do that? Do you think they love the opera? These people don't know the opera from the hole in the ground. I hate to sound cynical, but the whole concept of corporate giving, it's not just the frauds like these guys. The whole concept of corporate giving is image management, and that's where as you say, the woke business comes in. Giving to this cause, giving to that cause, giving to BLM. They don't care about Black Lives Mattering or not, man. They could care less. They're in it for the money. That's all they care about, the businesses that do this. They don't care about social change. They couldn't care less. They don't care about philanthropy. Eddie gave money to philanthropies. Bernie Madoff gave a ton of money to Jewish philanthropies. Do you think he gave a damn about Jewish philanthropies? He gave a lot of money, and they also wound up being one of his biggest clients. He wound up ripping them off. That shows how much he liked philanthropy. I hate to sound so completely cynical, but if 1 out of 100 of these business executives is sincere, uh, it would surprise it would really surprise me. In fact, I opened the book, I opened Retail Gangster by going into how Sam Antoine, some of the crazy Eddie executives, in fact, met an executive who really was sincere, who really was a he really did give money because he was genuinely altruistic. And this was such a shock to them that they were a little reluctant about dealing with this guy. They weren't used to dealing with the guy. But you can rest assured that everything that all the philanthropy and all the political donations are designed for image management. And in the case of FDX, I think you're dealing with something that's, I think, a little bit more sinister than that, because giving such immense sums. Now, this is sort of a new development, really. Eddie didn't give money I mean, maybe he gave political donations. It was not significant, but this is sort of a new spin on sort of a new development in fraud. Where you're basically bribing. Trying to bribe your way into the good graces of regulators, and that's kind of what Beekman Fried was doing. He was the second biggest donor to the Democratic Party during the 2021-2022 election cycle. He was, I think, also one of the biggest donors to Biden in his 2020 election campaign. And, one of the things that you're going to have to look for, I think people should be looking for going forward, they're in bankruptcy proceedings currently. One of the things you want to look for going forward is whether he gave dirty money to these guys that under the bankruptcy laws is going to have to be clawed back. Madoff gave money he gave some of the money that Madoff dispersed had to be clawed back by the trustee. So one of the things that you want to look to, that people should be thinking about in the future are the FDX bankruptcy trustees going to want to claw back the money that the ex-CEO gave in political donations?
Now, that question raises another example of, a particularly odious personality with similarly, sociopathic inclinations from a different angle, and that's none other than Jeffrey Epstein, another big Democratic Party, personality who completely did not kill himself, of course, but whose reputation, met its end as a result of his shenanigans. And nevertheless, all the people, all his associates in the political circles, as horrifying as his story was, they were part of this, and nothing happened. And here they are, and now they're accepting money and hanging around with people like Sam Beekman-Fried. So, I mean, all of this feigned indignation at people like Epstein, and after you don't learn the lesson and you continue associating with clearly unscrupulous, self-serving personalities, this speaks less of individual con artists and more of a con artist culture permeating business and political circles and media and social circles, because this seems to be, you get one successful fraud once in a while. It happens, people get fooled, whatever. But when you have a series of events, one after another, and it's all the same circles, are these people really falling for the shtick, or are they part of a much bigger scam? That's the question that naturally arises.
Well, look, let's go back a few decades. Let's go back to the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, when organized crime was very big, not just in New York City and not just in the Northeast, but in Las Vegas and in Florida and whatever. Mobsters were major political contributors. They gave a ton of money to the Democratic Party, local Democratic Party. When it was significant, when it suited their interest, they gave a lot of money to the Republican Party. They basically bought judges. They bought politicians. Frank Costello, who was head of a crime family, later became known as the Genovese crime family. Frank Costello was known for his political connections, for having judges in his pockets, political leaders in his pockets. And in fact, some political leaders, like Carmine DeSapio in Greenwich Village, they went to prison because of their associations with organized crime. Mobsters owned a good many judges, and of course, there was police corruption. So police corruption and political corruption in New York of the 1930s, 1940s, 50s, Boston to a large extent, New Jersey certainly. Political corruption was not a conspiracy theory. It was a well-known fact. Now, I'm not saying that's what's happening now, but I do think that when you look at the amounts of money that pour into the coffers of both political parties, it's not just the Democrats. People, I think, need to start thinking in terms. They need to let their imaginations work and think to themselves, why are these corporations, why are these business executives being so generous? Are they such civic-minded people, or are they trying to influence the course of their own businesses?
There is something else to be said, which is that organized crime has a long-standing reputation of laundering money through philanthropic ventures and whitewashing their reputations. And that's true as much of the Sicilian mafia as it's of the mob in Russia. And a lot of the oligarchs who are known for their donations and investments came from crooks and thieves, quite
Oh,
frankly, in Russia. And the question about these types of guys who are emerging out of somewhere, these are not, low. A lot of these people are not low level, petty criminals of the street. They come from respectable families. They come from social circles and particular environments. And to me, when you have that sort of thing, and you have that many people who are that unscrupulous, and when there's so many things wrong, and not just one. FTX is a complete mess. There's the lawyer who is now being tasked with saving the company. He discussed a number of items that have been horrifyingly wrong, from client fund embezzlement for personal use to mismanagement of security, to all of these things, culminating in a huge hack of that took away $1 to $2 billion in one night. And the thing that makes me wonder whether the hack itself wasn't part of the con by some of their parties to basically salvage some of the money before the feds made away with it and move it someplace else. I mean, I'm sorry to be that cynical, but clearly a lot of people had to be in on it to some extent for something like that to happen. Because when you're that open, when that so many things that are so big, and it's not just one guy pulling off a Ponzi scheme. It's a whole team of people. He had multiple companies involved, and they were all kind of Alameda and FTX were involved in double dealing under his supervision. And you had all these other guys who were privy to all of this, who were doing real estate dealings with them, who were doing all sorts of businesses with them. How did they all not know? It seems to me that the knowledge of this, that they had a lot more facilitators of actual criminal activity than even Eddie with his small family business. Because here it's an entire group of people who had to be in some way culpable, beyond just being supposedly naive enough to take donations. That I don't buy that nobody knew what was really happening.
Oh, sure. Well, I think as this FTX scandal plays out, and it'll be playing out, I think you're going to see, probably sooner rather than later, you're going to see an informant come forward. Now, this is what you sort of like, for an informed viewer or an informed reader, what you want to look out for is the informant. Who's going to come forward to blow the whistle? Because that's going to happen, assuming that these people are under criminal investigation, as I believe they are, and as it would be ridiculous if they weren't under criminal investigation. The feds really know how to turn the screws. They're very, very good at getting informants. You got to give them credit. The securities regulators, they have a really spotty record. But whatever you think of the FBI, they're very good, and also federal prosecutors. They're very, very good because they have the power to deprive you of your freedom for many decades. If they feel that there is a racketeering case, and as you just pointed out, without saying so specifically, what's happening at FTX has all the earmarks of a racketeering conspiracy. So what does that mean? It means that there's a lot of people involved, and one of the people involved who is knowledgeable of what happened is going to want to avoid being sent to prison for a very long period of time. So that's what you want to look out for in the next phase of this scandal. Who's going to be the rat?
So there's a couple of things that I found worthy of noting. First, the same lawyer who decried the complete failure of all these external controls and internal controls for that matter, pointed out that some of these guys could be, he's used the word compromise. Now, generally, what that points to is potentially foreign dealings that could have led to their being blackmailed or bribed or otherwise engaged with foreign actors with suspicious ties, potentially. No.
He might have meant something else, but but he did use the word compromised. And he also said, this situation is unprecedented, which, immediately made me think, that he has not read my book, No, it is not. It is precedented. But yeah, is it compromise?
But in that regard, I'm pointing to something specific that has kind of fallen under the radar, and that's the events immediately preceding the collapse of the company, which is their dealings with Binance. Binance is a huge exchange. It's known for circumvention of sanctions on Russia and operating in Russia as one of several such exchanges. And it's known for having ties, some of its members have ties to China. Now, the role of Binance in its business deals with FTX, unlike Alameda, has not been explored, and I don't know whether it will, but if I were the federal investigators, I would certainly at least look into the relationship between them, because to me, it smells like there's a lot more to the story than just FTX being careless, negligent, and greedy.
Well, this is a classic mess. This is the term of art, by the way, that the feds use in describing this type of situation. It is a mess. It is a classic mess. And they are going to have to put a team of investigators on this. Because, as you say, this has multinational implications, foreign governments, foreign entities, and it can have and there are political implications, as we discussed. Are they going to have to claw back all this money from the Democratic Party or from the people that he gave money to? It's a real mess.
This, unlike the Eddy story, this story has global implications. But what we have seen is that while the methods have become somewhat more sophisticated and updated with the emerging new financial and other, technological developments, blockchain and so forth, at the core, the story is still the same. People see an opportunity to screw somebody over using things that work, and whether they're one family or whether they're a group of roommates working together out of Bahamas, or whether they're they managed to kind of implement create an infrastructure that works, that is extensive, and that pulls down a lot of people wittingly and unwittingly. And my concern is how many people around the world who were not necessarily involved in the actual conspiracy or scheme or whatever it was will end up. What are the implications of something like that for everyone else who was working for them? Who invested in them, who was invested in the industry? What larger impact will we see as a result of this particular self-serving business scheme collapsing?
Yeah, well, look, It's in the bankruptcy courts now. As a matter of fact, I understand there's a fight going on between the bankruptcy courts in the Bahamas and the United States over where they're going to try this bankruptcy court. And when things go into bankruptcy, yeah, at this point it becomes under the aegis of the courts. But that's not the only. That's not the only avenue. There are, I'm sure, there are investigations going on of a criminal nature, and I wonder, where is Beekman-Fried? Does he have his passport? And why hasn't he fled to a jurisdiction that doesn't have a extradition treaty? Because put yourself in his place. You're going to be the principal target of a federal investigation. You may come back to the United States, be clamped in irons, and never see the light of day again. Because if this is indeed a fraud, and if it's as big as it's said to be, he's going away. So I would wonder, where is Beekman-Fried and why hasn't he fled? And I think, it wouldn't surprise me. I would not be surprised if the next turn to the screw is that Mr. Beekman-Fried absconds. Because that's exactly what happened with Crazy Eddie. And Eddie Antar wasn't facing anywhere near the kind of potential criminal liability as Beekman-Fried.
So there's been some discussions that supposedly he's stranded in the Bahamas, that supposedly Bahamas are looking to turn him over to the United States. But on the other hand, Sam himself has been extremely flippant in his communications, and he has been beyond brazen in some of the way he characterized his own enterprise. There's no remorse. His comments extremely ill-advised for someone facing a criminal probe, by the way, and that's me as a lawyer, characterizing an incentive of deceiving people through the philanthropic activity point to a mens rea. They point to a criminal intent, or at the very least, a deceptive, unethical intent. Yeah. And he is talking about it out of Bahamas, where he might be extradited at any moment, and
I would say that unless Beekman-Fried is in custody, he is a flight risk. He can get into a private plane and take off. When you have enough money, you can buy your way out of any situation except possibly a prison cell. So I would say that if Beekman-Fried is not in custody, he might never appear in the United States again. And unless he's delusional, or unless he really is innocent. I mean, he hasn't been charged with any crime yet. Unless he really is innocent, in which he'll want to come back and face the music. But there's an excellent chance, like I said, he's not coming back.
But there is already evidence of embezzlement of client funds. Regardless of a broader conspiracy, that in itself is a crime.
Oh, sure. But there are jurisdictions where anything short of murder. There are jurisdictions out there that do not have.
Sure.
Indonesia is just one example. There are other countries which don't have extradition treaties with the United States.
So the question is,
murder. You can go there and you can get away. And this man has a ton of money. So that possibility. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but that possibility should not be excluded.
Why hasn't he fled already? And do you think the U.S. government, or at least, the Democratic Party that is currently in charge of the government, is going to let him leave rather than having the embarrassment of having him testify in court and having to spill the beans and all these unethical donations and who knows what else was going on?
Well, obviously, were he to leave, were he to not appear in court, were he to not be held accountable, that's one of the things that would, even if in fact there was no sort of nefarious activity going on, that's the sort of thing where people would naturally assume. That's the suspicion that would take place. So yeah, like I say, it's a huge mess. You have a possible principal target who's in the Bahamas, apparently at liberty. You have connections with multiple foreign governments and foreign entities. billions and billions and billions of dollars, possibly one of the biggest crimes, possibly one of the biggest crimes in history. So yeah, this is this is just the opening curtain. This is the orchestra, with the prelude before the curtain opens. The curtain will open.
There's a couple of other denouements the story could take, and and at this point, this is just pure speculation on my end. One, he does get indicted,
Mm.
or whether or not he pleads, he, at the very least, in absentia, charges will be made. He may not, something happens to him. He meets the Jeffrey Epstein, and, prematurely, if not, and quite frankly, he's made a lot of enemies just by having all that money collapse, and there'll be always somebody angry enough to take action. That's one possibility, and I can't imagine him not thinking about that. The other possibility is the Edward Snowden / Julian Assange scenario, where he ends up in some adversarial country or semi-adversarial country, potentially providing those countries with insider information on the workings of whatever institutions he was, had knowledge of, political circles, their private lives. Basically, what I'm saying here is that not only himself is potentially compromised, but everyone he has been around with becomes open to blackmail from foreign agents as a result of him being free and potentially going somewhere.
Sure, all those things are possible. I tend to think my opinion is a little bit more humdrum. I think he may very well flee Bahamas or wherever the hell he is. If he's not in custody, I think he may very well flee. If he's afraid, he will flee, and I think he has an ample reason to be afraid. And I think that there will definitely be political repercussions. Now, what the nature of those repercussions are, I wouldn't speculate. I have the slightest idea, but you never know.
Now, that's interesting. First of all, two kind of final questions to wrap this all up. When do you think the movie is going to be made? Either about Eddie or or FTX, or both of them, frankly. A series about the colorful characters of frauds.
Yes, and let's not forget, by the way, we mustn't forget. I don't know if we mentioned it, but the name of the book is Retail Gangster. I don't know whether we mentioned
Exactly.
that.
It's
Did we
a,
mention that the name of the book is Retail Gangster? I don't know if we mentioned that. I don't know. I haven't received any queries from any movie people in the past 4 hours, so maybe there's no interest.
well, at the very least, I think it would be a great opening to an entire, series about all these guys, and maybe seeing a pattern of these people one after another will make the public less susceptible to falling for these, false promises and, fool's gold. I mean, I think it would be a great title for a series, Fool's Gold. This is
Yeah.
what these people are delivering.
Well, as a matter of fact, there is a movie being made. I understand that there was to be a movie being made about Theranos, about Elizabeth Holmes. I don't know if that went anywhere, but there was a pretty serious movie project on that. Oh, and I'm sure that, particularly with that sex angle that we've been hearing about in the Bahamas, well, I have no
Yeah,
doubt there'll be one on FDX. Forget about it. Definitely. As far as crazy it is concerned, who knows?
now the other issue is what's next for you now that Eddie has made his debut in the public eye. What are you thinking about next?
Well, I'm working on a couple of things. I'm not really at liberty at this point to discuss what they are, but I have a couple of irons in the fire. Let's let it go at that.
Well, that sounds exciting, and I'm certainly looking forward to the next project. I'm sure it'll be something provocative, fun, and timely.
Yes.
the way
Well,
things
I'll tell you
were.
one thing. I'll tell you what the project is not going to be. It certainly isn't going to be FDX because this, as I said, this is a mess. Who the
I think
hell?
this one is going to take years to
Yeah,
uncover.
no. I mean, the thing about retail guy, I think about Crazy Eddie. I mean, it was a confined story. I mean, first of all, it's a story of a specific group of people in 1980s New York. So it's evocative of a time and a place. And even though they were criminals, Eddie there was a likability. I know it's hard to believe. There was a likability to the guy. There was a likability. There's a certain charm to the whole situation. And that wasn't the thing that set Eddie Antar apart. There was nothing charming about Madoff. There doesn't appear to be anything charming about this dude. I keep forgetting his name, Beekman Seam or whatever his name is. The FDX guy. I just saw that someone gave an interview where they said that the man had absolutely no charm whatsoever. But Eddie Andrew was charming, and that made it into an interesting story. You see, who wants to deal with scum like this? I don't know if I'd want to do that, but you never know.
So that's interesting. Whereas Eddie had some sort of a, kind of fun, natural characteristics, these later fellows are basically their only attraction to anybody with the promise of money.
Yeah, there was nothing charming about Madoff. My God, what a scum! They made two movies about Madoff. One he was portrayed by Richard Dreyfuss, and the other by Robert De Niro. Two fine actors, and they both were. Well, they did great performances, but they're performing. They're trying to portray a guy who had absolutely no positive characteristics whatsoever. Whereas Eddie had he had sort of a native charm about him. He had a magnetism. So you couldn't say. I mean, he did evil things, but you couldn't really necessarily say that he was an evil person like Madoff and possibly like these more recent individuals, such as Ms. Holmes. Ms. Holmes has been portrayed as a really wonderful individual, does good work and so forth. But then she tried to really destroy the life of one of the whistleblowers. What good works? What nice person. He was a miserable individual. Eddie did miserable things. He was a wife beater. He was a miserable person in many respects. But there was this odd sort of duality to his personality, the charm, the fact that he had genuine talent as a businessman. I mean, that's something that you don't really find in latter generation of scamsters that much. Well, you do with Madoff to some extent, but there were contradictions to the Eddie Antar story that I found fascinating.
Hmm. So it sounds to me like this, the later guys, they're kind of nothing more than just greedy imitators who are
Yeah.
put on a persona, and they not they don't really have it in them. They just they just use the media to prop themselves up, and they're basically taking advantage of a generation where it's very easy to make a lot of publicity very quickly, or
Yeah, well, it's a little bit like the story of the Birdman of Alcatraz. It was made into a great movie with Burt Lancaster as this horrible murderer and criminal who became this great bird expert.
Mhm.
That was the movie Birdman of Alcatraz, one of the best known prison movies ever made. The real Birdman of Alcatraz, Robert Stroud, was disgusting, pederast, a horrible individual who deserved to be locked up. He was no Burt Lancaster, but
Mhm.
the image of Robert Stroud is Burt Lancaster. It's a phony image, and that's what you're seeing nowadays with these corporate scam artists. They project a phony image. They're really more like Robert Stroud, shall we say, than Burt Lancaster. You can say that. But Eddie, on the other hand, had genuine qualities. Can't be denied.
So it's funny. Maybe our media, our social classes should start questioning not just the frauds who take advantage of the system, but what we end up valuing and what we are placing our value in.
Yes. Oh, yes, yes, yes. Yes, yes, and don't believe every cover story that you see in the financial press and the next Warren Buffett. It may be another Sam Beekman-Fried.
Yeah, maybe instead of having the next Warren Buffett or the next Mark Zuckerberg, maybe we should have somebody who is the first of their own kind and actually does something genuine, even if it's not as glamorous or interesting.
Yeah, you put your finger on it.
Well, thank you so much for this excellent discussion, and I
Well, thank
hope
you.
that everyone here takes a look, goes out and gets a copy of Retail Gangster.
Retail Gangster. It's crazy. It's
insane. It's insane. This whole thing does sound insane. I think we need to attack the crazy Eddie tag to all of these stories.
Well, thanks for having me, Ariane.
And for those watching the program, we'll be back next week, Tuesday night at the usual time, 9 p.m. Thank you so much for watching, and